There is unlikely to be a single professional among you who has not encountered the language of EDI, equality, diversity and inclusion, particularly in relation to the UK's rights-based legislation, most notably the Equality Act of 2010 and its integration into healthcare and higher education policy and practice. Just as the expanding alphabet used to describe different sexual orientations and gender identities evolved, EDI has also developed. Alternative versions such as DEI, diversity, equity and inclusion, sit alongside further extended forms of the abbreviation that now include belonging and justice. For colleagues working in forensic healthcare settings, of course, justice carries a double meaning. It encompasses both the ethical fairness central to person-centred, trauma-informed DEIBJ practice, as well as formal legal processes linked to criminal justice systems. This video provides a brief overview of how these terms and policies emerged. But what matters most for you, however, is how you translate these broad concepts into meaningful, workable approaches within the complexities and constraints of advanced forensic healthcare practice. Where did our contemporary concepts of equality, diversity and inclusion come from? Well, their roots stretch back far, well before first-wave feminism of the mid-19th century. By the early 20th century, suffragette movements in the UK and USA in particular had expanded beyond voting rights for women to demand wider legal, political, financial and social recognition of women as equal citizens to men. Spanning across the late 1800s and early 20th century, ideas of equality were largely framed in dualistic terms. The relationship between men and women, especially around the notion of enfranchisement. As voting rights for women increased, activists shifted attention to other exclusions, such as access to becoming members of parliament, entry into the professions including medicine, higher education, property rights and inheritance. These advancements were key precursors to today's gender equality legislation. As time progressed, the struggle for equality broadened. Civil rights movements, particularly in the USA, sought parity for black and brown people in education, housing, employment and political participation, exactly down to the right for sitting freely on public transport next to white people. Across feminist, racial and later sexuality-related movements, the notion of immutability gained traction. That is, the understanding that certain characteristics, such as sex or ethnicity, may be inherent and unchangeable, yet differences between people do not imply superiority of one and inferiority of the other. This framing shaped later LGBT equality campaigns, sometimes expressed in slogans such as "Born This Way," although such essentialist views have been critiqued within later queer theory. Other contemporary events, such as the global campaign for women's sexual safety in the #MeToo campaign, and in the Black Lives Matter response to the murder of the American citizen George Floyd in 2014 by a white police officer. In the UK, the legacy of Stephen Lawrence and the 1999 Macpherson report continue to expose institutional racism, which hopefully drives racial equality debates. In parallel with gender and racial movements, LGBTQ+ people's rights campaigns accelerated throughout the 20th century. The 1969 Stonewall riots in Greenwich Village, New York City, are widely recognised as a pivotal moment, galvanising modern pride movements and accelerating the push for lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans people's equality. In the UK, key steps occurred even earlier than Stonewall, however. The 1950s CHE, Campaign for Homosexual Equality, leading to the Wolfenden Committee report of 1957, recommended the first partial decriminalisation of male homosexual acts between consenting adults over the age of 21. That laid foundations for legislative and social changes ever since. This trajectory culminated decades later in the legislation for same-sex marriage in 2013, followed by continuing efforts to protect minority genders and sexualities despite the 2025 UK Supreme Court ruling on biologically essentialist immutability notions of what it is to be a woman. Equality alone was not enough. Movements increasingly argued that equity or fairness, customised to people's differing needs, must accompany legal equality alongside the celebration of human difference. Key legislative milestones in the UK include the Disability Discrimination Act of 1995 and its integration into the Equality Act 2010. But law is only part of the story. Everyday language, lack of accessibility, resources and even toilet signage can reinforce discriminatory assumptions. As you reflect on this slide, consider the various words, the signs and symbols you encounter in your own daily lives. Ask yourselves, what messages do they send, especially to people impacted by them? And how might such signs shape the experiences of individuals living with disabilities or difference? These examples offer only a glimpse of the wider, more intricate histories underpinning contemporary equality frameworks. Yet they highlight key trajectories, movements centered on gender, ethnicity or race, sexualities, gender minorities, and people living with various disabilities. Movements supporting each of these groups of people help cement the principle that equality is not about making everyone the same. It is about ensuring that human diversity, whether linked to gender, ethnicity, orientations, or abilities, do not become a basis for exclusion, discrimination, or further injustice. Many rights-based principles have now extended to other forms of human difference, including learning and cognitive diversity. Concepts such as neurodiversity and diagnoses for ADHD and autism have undergone significant reframing away from any deficit-based understandings and disabilities towards recognition of diverse ways of thinking, of learning and of being. However, celebration of diversity must not obscure the real-world vulnerabilities experienced by many individuals, particularly in custodial or criminal justice settings. Forensic practitioners frequently encounter people whose neurodivergence intersects with trauma, offending behaviour, vulnerability to victimization, and barriers to communication, which require of you skilled, sensitive, and adaptable approaches in custody and in care. While equality focuses on treating everyone the same, equity recognises that individuals come from different starting points and therefore require different forms of support to achieve fair and equal outcomes. For advanced forensic practitioners working in police custodies and SARCs, equity is essential, because the people you encounter as patients or clients, as well as co-workers, often face layered and intersectional disadvantage linked to their gender, ethnicity, disability, neurodiversity, sexuality, or a whole load of other forms of social marginalisation. To achieve any sort of equality, we must first apply equity as a means for adapting healthcare assessments, communication requirements, and sometimes even the settings or environments in which you work. We also need to consider or maybe reconsider safeguarding policies and clinical decision processes to meet individual, person-centred, and for some, trauma-informed healthcare needs. Prioritising people, our patients or clients, we're required to recognise structural inequalities, easing the inequality effects during your contact, and ensuring that every person, regardless of background and intersectional demographics, has a fair opportunity to engage, to understand, and to be heard effectively. Embedding DEIBJ in forensic healthcare settings involves more than compliance with policy. It requires deliberate, reflexive action with multi-agency cooperation. Practitioners in custody and SARCs can model DEIBJ by ensuring environments are person-centred and welcoming, where communication is accessible and care pathways acknowledge diverse cultural, gendered, sexual, neurodiverse and disabled identities, some or many of whom might equally be impacted by previous traumas and pain. DEIBJ practice, along with our professional codes of conduct, also means challenging discriminatory assumptions, seeking training that enhances cultural and trauma-informed competence, and supporting colleagues through inclusive team practices. When implemented well, DEIBJ strengthens clinical quality, builds trust with your service users, and creates a professional culture where both staff and detainees or victims feel respected, feel safe, and feel valued. Do not overlook intersectionality, or what I've referred to elsewhere as intersectionality, which recognises how multiple dimensions of identity shape a person's experience. Sex, sexual practices, sexual orientations, and gender identities interact with the person's ethnicity, their age range, their disabilities, neurodiversity, socioeconomic status, sometimes faith or religion, and so many other personal demographics in your clients' individual lives. For people seeking care, these factors combine to influence their vulnerability and risk. The intersectional factors sometimes lead to misunderstood communication, can reinforce trauma responses, and deter genuine health and help-seeking behaviours. Intersectionality reminds us that no one characteristic exists in isolation. Holistic, sensitive and contextualised care must account for the full constellation of factors that shape a person's lived reality. For those of you advanced forensic healthcare professionals working in police custody settings, the difference you make lies in your willingness to see the person behind the behaviour, behind the allegations or circumstances for detainment. You can ensure detainees are treated with dignity, that their health needs are identified promptly, and that their individual vulnerabilities, whether linked to trauma, neurodiversity, ethnicity, gender, or any other personal demographic, are fully recognised and respected. What may seem small actions, such as adapting communication styles or environments, for example, reducing noise, being aware of lighting effects, and especially through advocating for reasonable adjustments or providing trauma-informed reassurance, can profoundly affect a detainee's experience of safety. By applying equitable, person-centered care, you play a crucial role in reducing harm and upholding justice for some of society's most marginalized individuals. For those of you working in a sexual offences setting, a SARC or associated practice, the difference you can make equally extends beyond immediate clinical care. You hold a unique position in supporting victims of sexual violence at one of the most vulnerable points in their lives. By applying DEIBJ principles, you create a space where survivors of any gender or ethnicity, orientation, ability, or neurodivergent profile can feel believed, can feel respected and safe. Adjusting communication, offering culturally informed care, recognizing trauma responses, especially during any form of physical or clinical examination to avoid re-traumatization, and ensuring equitable pathways for all people will help restore agency and dignity in the person's life. Your sensitivity and professionalism can influence recovery, engagement with justice processes, and longer-term well-being, making your role both powerful and profoundly meaningful. Thank you all so much for working your way through this video. I hope this learning supports you in your professional and clinical practice, helping you make a positive difference in people's lives.